When I retired, I thought I would finally be able to enjoy life in peace. Doing some gardening, maybe fishing on the weekends. But things didn't turn out that way. Somehow, the money became tight, because the pension, well, is like a teaspoon for a giant soup pot. So, I took a job as a security guard at a hotel. The idea was simple: you sit at your station, watch the monitors, and make sure there are no violations. But honestly, I never imagined that this job would lead me to new adventures that I hadn't seen, even at 60. So, we have this one family suite, spacious, with all the amenities. But more often than not, it's not families with kids who rent it, as you might think, but young people. And one day, a cheerful crowd arrived. 5 young guys, 2 girls. One of them, a really beautiful, bright, fashionable girl from head to toe. Back then, I thought, well, they're definitely not going to a museum. You could tell right away, they weren't here to sleep, they came to celebrate, party, and maybe even do more. At first, everything was as usual. The group unpacked bottles of champagne, laughed, ordered pizza. The standard situation for those who rent a room for a party. I was sitting in my security booth, sipping coffee, and almost dozing off to the monotonous hum of the surveillance cameras. But within an hour, I saw that the evening was picking up steam. We have cameras not only in the hallways but also in the elevators and even near the pool. So, I saw the group go back down. The guys were a bit tipsy, and the girls were already dancing right in the elevator. It was even a bit funny if I had known then where it would all lead. And that's when it started. The girlfriend of one of the guys, let's call her Carmen, was clearly not as innocent as she might have seemed at first glance. Instead of staying with her boyfriend, she started flirting with his friends. Well, you know how it is, under the influence, in the right mood, the dancing started turning into something more. One of her boyfriend's friends, let's call him Manuel, began doing more than just holding her hand. And just when I thought it would be better not to watch anymore, things were only beginning. Her boyfriend, Luis, had stepped out, and Carmen started doing things that, you don't talk about at family dinners. I took another sip of coffee, turned away from the monitor, but something made me look again. And that's when the real show started. I'm not a young man anymore, I've seen a lot in my life, but something like this. Well, long story short, she started dancing with Manuel, and it ended with them dancing on the couch. And you know how it is, when everyone's drunk, the mind no longer controls the body. Picture this: I'm sitting in front of the monitors, and they're there, in the family suite, relaxing, in their own way. Laughter, shouting, chaos. And then the other guys joined in, and suddenly the whole group didn't look like they were celebrating a birthday, but like actors in some cheap drama. And of course, I should have just closed my eyes and stopped watching. But you know how it is, curiosity takes over. I could have called the police or at least gone to warn them. But the more I watched, the more I realized that it was already too late. They were all far from being in their right minds. At that moment, I promised myself I wouldn't watch any longer, but what happened next? Stay tuned for the end of this video, and you'll be shocked. So, as I said, I promised myself not to watch any more, but, in such situations, it's hard to look away. Something kept me glued there, and instead of going home or at least checking what was happening in the hallways, I kept sitting and staring at the screen. Maybe it was because I was once young myself and remembered my own adventures, or maybe I just wanted to see how it would all end. Let's get back to our group. Carmen, wasting no time, continued flirting with Manuel, while the other guys started joining in the fun. And at this point, the situation began to go beyond what could be called just a party. They were all, without exception, already tipsy, and you could feel that things were heading in a very specific direction. It wasn't just dancing and drinking anymore, it was like a show, with each participant playing the lead role. Luis's friends, including Alejandro and Rafael, started doing something very unexpected. I mean, they weren't just sitting there. One by one, they started collaborating with Carmen. And the girl seemed to be genuinely enjoying it and didn't stop. And me? Well, I no longer felt like a security guard, I felt more like a spectator in some adult movie, where the director was the alcohol. Luis returned to the room, and, for a moment, I thought he would see it all and cause a scene. Makes sense, right? Your girlfriend with your friends in a room, clearly not just drinking champagne. But no. He walked in, smiled, poured himself another drink, and continued the fun, not paying attention to what Carmen was doing. Maybe he was also under the influence or just decided that everything was fine, but the situation took on a completely wild character. At this point, when I was seriously considering that I needed to do something unexpected happened. One of the guys, Rafael, glanced toward the camera. For a moment, I got scared that he had seen how I was watching them. But no, fortunately, he was too drunk to notice the details. However, that little thing reminded me that, after all, I was at work, and maybe my job wasn't just to watch them having fun. But, as is often the case, I made a completely different decision. My curiosity reached its peak, and instead of sounding the alarm or at least going to tell the management, I decided to visit that room personally. And yes, I know what you're thinking right now, why did you go there? That was your chance to stop everything. But no, I had completely different plans. I walked up to the door, knocked. To my surprise, they opened the door right away, and I was greeted by Carmen, who didn't seem at all surprised that a security guard might show up. On the contrary, she invited me in, and that's when I realized they considered me part of their entertainment. I didn't refuse, I decided to see it through to the end. And what happened next? Oh, believe me, this is just the beginning of what I have to tell you. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the faces of the guys. They looked so relaxed and satisfied with life, as if they had completely forgotten where they were. Someone was drinking straight from the bottle, others were laughing, and Carmen was the center of attention, as if she were the real star of this party. At that moment, I understood, this was no longer just observation, I had become part of their show. What happened next is hard to put into words, and YouTube probably wouldn't allow it. But I'll tell you this, that evening changed my perspective on my job as a security guard forever. As you can see, sometimes life throws surprises your way that you never expect. And what happened next? Oh, wait for the next part, and I'll tell you everything. But for now, think about it, what would you have done in my place? I walked into the room, and the first thing that caught my eye was how they were relaxing in there. The guys were laid back, the bottles were being passed from hand to hand, the laughter was so loud that it seemed like it was just an ordinary party. And me? They immediately invited me to the table. I'm an experienced security guard, but when they poured me the first glass, I had already forgotten that I had any duties. Carmen went to the kitchen, where Manuel, her boyfriend, was helping to heat something up, and I found that a bit odd, but I didn't pay much attention to it. Then Luis, Carmen's boyfriend, started proposing a toast. He poured for both me and himself, and we clinked glasses. Instantly, warmth spread through my body, and when you're retired, alcohol hits you quickly, and before you know it, you're already raising the second glass. We sat at the table, chatting about trivial matters. Luis, at first glance, seemed like a normal guy. A little tipsy, but everything was within reason. And suddenly, I noticed that Carmen and Manuel had already disappeared from the room. They had quietly slipped into the bedroom, as if nothing had happened. I thought to myself, maybe they just went to talk. But then completely different sounds began coming from that room. You know what I mean, the kind of sounds that leave no room for doubt. Luis, meanwhile, was talking to me about Carmen. He was telling me how much he loved her, how they'd been together for a few years, and how she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And there I was, listening to him while hearing what was happening in the next room. It even made me feel a bit awkward, but what could I do? Luis was too drunk to realize that his beloved was communicating with his friend at that very moment. And it wasn't just obvious, it was so loud that the walls were shaking. Luis kept pouring more drinks, and I started to feel like I was becoming part of this show. And you know, at that moment, I didn't even think that this was something that couldn't be tolerated. Maybe I should have already gone to that room and set things straight, but something held me back. Maybe it was the feeling that I was just a guest at this celebration of life? Or maybe it was simply curiosity. And just as I was starting to lose myself in Luis's monologue about how he was planning to propose to Carmen, the door to the bedroom opened, and another one of his friends, Alejandro, walked in. And it was then that I realized this wasn't just a friendly chat. Things were headed in a completely different direction. Luis kept talking, unaware of anything, and at that moment, I started thinking, why not join in? To be honest, it was that feeling you get when you want to do something forbidden, but something holds you back. And the only thing that held me back was the fact that I was the security guard of this hotel, and no matter how you looked at it, this wasn't my business. But on the other hand, Carmen was clearly showing that this was her own initiative. She was having the time of her life, and none of the guys seemed to want to stop it. Luis, strangely enough, kept drinking more and more, and at some point, he started telling me his life stories. He told me how he met Carmen, how they started dating, and that he was even planning to propose to her. And right there, while listening to him, I realized that this guy had no idea what was going on behind that door. And me? I sat there, nodding my head, while thinking, brother, if only you knew. Strange thoughts began to cross my mind. What if I went over there? What if I became part of this strange game? To be honest, I wouldn't have minded going and seeing how it all looked live. After all, you don't get to see things like that every day in my line of work. But something still held me back, perhaps a residual sense of decency or the feeling that this had gone too far. Luis kept talking, and I was barely holding myself back from going to the others. From time to time, I glanced at the door leading to that room. And even through the door, I could hear sounds that started putting unsavory thoughts in my head. And that's when I realized that maybe this was the best moment to stop. But at the same time, I couldn't tear myself away from this situation. It was like staring into a fire, fascinating and dangerous at the same time. So, there I was, sitting at the table, drinking beer, while Luis was already completely knocked out. He was lying on the couch, completely unaware of what was happening behind that closed door. And me? Honestly, I didn't know what to do. There was my chance. I, a security guard, who was supposed to be maintaining order, and here in front of me was this door, behind which something far more than just a party was going on. A situation that initially seemed innocent had turned into something completely different. I was sipping my beer, staring at the door, feeling how curiosity was consuming me. And then one of the guys, Rafael, came over to me. He grinned slyly and said, "What's up, old man, you want in too? I see you're staring at that door like you're waiting for your turn." Of course, I was surprised. It was too blunt, and for a moment, I didn't even know what to say. But then I pulled myself together and told him, "It's none of your business." And he just smiled even wider and added, "Come on, just go in. Today's your day. Enjoy the young fruit, Carmen. Believe me, she's quite something." I was sitting there, gripping my beer bottle, feeling everything boiling inside me. You know, I never would have thought that I'd find myself in a situation like this. But now everything was so real that my life, which until that day had been so routine and predictable, seemed to have been turned upside down. I looked once more at Luis, who was snoring on the couch, and realized, he no longer cared what was happening behind those doors. And the other guys seemed to understand that things had already gone too far. And so I got up, walked to the door, opened it, and what do you think? Carmen, lying on the bed with all those guys, looked at me and smiled. She wasn't surprised, she wasn't upset, quite the opposite. She looked at me like someone she had been waiting for all along. Finally, she said quietly and got up from the bed. "Guys, go, leave us alone. Tonight, he's my guest." The guys began to leave the room, smiling and winking at me. I stood in the doorway, not knowing what to do next. But Carmen was absolutely confident. She came closer, looking me straight in the eye, and I understood that I had found myself in a situation that had long since gotten out of control. And so, I was left alone with her. The room went quiet, and only we were standing there in the middle of this scene. She raised her hand and touched my face, smiling. "Tonight, you'll do everything you've ever dreamed of," she said, and I felt my heart start to race. You know, sometimes life throws surprises at you, and you find yourself in situations you never thought of. And here I was, an old security guard who was supposed to be maintaining order, but instead, I had found myself at the center of events that definitely weren't part of my daily duties. Carmen led me to the bed, and everything that happened next was so unexpected and at the same time so desired that I think, for a moment, I lost control. We were alone, and she gave me all the time and attention I could have only dreamed of in my life. It was that moment when dreams come true, although in the most unpredictable way. And what happened next? Well, those details I'll keep to myself. But if you want to know more, wait for the next part, because this story isn't over yet. Carmen was ruthless in the best sense of the word. She did everything I could have ever dreamed of in my life. And all of it, so effortlessly, as if it were something completely natural for her. She kept saying that she wanted me to enjoy myself and that she was willing to do anything I wanted. At first, I couldn't even believe my eyes and ears. How could something like this even be possible? But Carmen seemed like she had been waiting to show me a new world, where there were no limits. We weren't in any rush, we were savoring the moment, and I realized that this was something special. She took care of every detail, every moment, and I was completely drawn into this game, where there was no room for doubt or hesitation. It was that moment when you forget about everything, your age, your job, your responsibilities. You just give yourself over to the wave of emotions and sensations. In the end, when it was all over, I felt completely exhausted, but not tired, rather the opposite, I felt reborn. My mind was clear, my body light, and inside, there was a strange energy coursing through me. I walked out of the room, as if waking from a long, deep sleep, realizing that my whole life was still ahead of me. Carmen followed me, smiling as if this was just the beginning. She looked satisfied, and it didn't seem like anything had ended for her. There was a fire in her eyes that, it seemed, was just starting to burn brighter. We walked into the kitchen, and she pulled 2 bottles of beer from the fridge. She opened them with one quick motion and handed me one, smiling as if this was a sign of something bigger. "Cheers," she said, raising the bottle. I took a sip of beer, and it went down so smoothly, like never before. The whole evening felt like a dream, but at the same time, every moment was so real that I couldn't take my eyes off her. We sat in the kitchen, drinking, and Carmen couldn't stop looking at me. She gazed at me with the same desire I had seen in her eyes all night. And before I could say anything, she was already beside me. She leaned in close, so easily and casually, and began doing what she had done earlier, but this time, right there in the kitchen. I couldn't believe this was happening again. Everything became even more intense, if that was even possible. Her movements were precise, full of confidence, and I just gave in to what was happening. It was so overwhelming that I lost track of time. Even the kitchen began to feel less real. All I could see and feel was Carmen and her touch. When she finally stopped, I just sat there, out of breath but filled with the same energy as before. She smiled, sat down next to me, and, as if nothing had happened, took another sip of beer. "Well, how was it?" she asked, winking. I just nodded, because I had no words left. It was one of those moments when even the best words couldn't describe all the feelings. "You know, I don't think you're used to these kinds of adventures," she added with a smile. "But this isn't over for tonight." I looked at her in surprise. How could it not be over? After all this? But Carmen was already in her own world. She was so confident, so calm, as if she had a clear plan. "I'm not interested in my friends anymore," she suddenly said, putting the beer bottle down. "This night is just ours. And if you think that's all, you're very mistaken." I sighed and looked at the clock. "I still have to work," I muttered, though deep down, I knew that after all this, I couldn't just go back to my usual shift. Work, she laughed. No, tonight you're with me. Forget about work. And at that moment, I suddenly realized that maybe she was right. Maybe work could wait, and this moment would never come again. And then, without hesitation, I made my choice. And what happened next? Oh, take your time. This story still has a few unexpected twists that will surely surprise you. But I'll save that for the next part. After everything that happened in the kitchen, I decided to return to my office. It seemed like the best decision, to cool down a bit, gather my thoughts, return to reality. I sat in my chair, stretched my legs on the desk, and took a deep breath. My heart was still pounding from all those events, and my head was filled with thoughts. How could all of this have happened? I, a security guard, who was supposed to keep order, and instead I had become the center, no, even more, an active participant in all this. But just when I thought everything had finally ended, there was a quiet knock on the door. And who was it, if not Carmen? She walked into my office so lightly and naturally, as if it were her own home and not the hotel where I worked. She smiled with her confident look, walked up to me, and, without giving me a chance to say anything, took my hand. "Don't think it's over," she whispered in my ear. And by then, I could no longer, and didn't want to, resist. She was so charming, so confident, that I just gave in to what was happening. We were together until dawn. She made that night unforgettable in every way. And finally, as the sun was rising, I felt like it was all coming to an end. But no, Carmen was still herself, still in the game. Around 7 in the morning, I heard Luis beginning to wake up. I froze for a moment, fearing he might notice her absence. But Carmen didn't worry at all. She got up with ease, turned to me, and smiled. "I'll go back to the room before he notices," she said. "Don't worry, he won't find out anything." And it was so easy for her, as if all of this was just routine. She quickly fixed herself up, winked at me, and left. I sat there, stunned by how cool-headed she was about all of it. And sure enough, a few minutes later, I heard her entering the room and telling Luis that she had gone out in the morning to have coffee. He didn't even doubt her words. When I overheard this, a strange feeling came over me. I realized that this guy had absolutely no idea what had happened during the night. He truly believed that everything was under control, that his beloved girlfriend had simply been a bit delayed and that there were no other stories involved. But then the moment came when they started packing up to leave the hotel. I returned to my duties, standing at the exit, watching as they all packed their things and got ready to leave. Luis looked completely satisfied and calm, unaware of anything. He walked up to me, shook my hand, and gave it a firm squeeze. "Thank you, old man," he said with a sincere smile. "For everything. Especially for that honest talk yesterday. You're a real great guy." I didn't know what to say. My throat went dry, and I just smiled in return, though I felt very awkward. Luis was sincerely thanking me for being honest, but if only he knew what really happened. Carmen, as always, was at her best. She walked up to me and thanked me too, but her thank you was much more intimate. She winked and quietly whispered, "Thank you for the wonderful evening." It was so playful and light that I almost burst out laughing, but I held myself back. It was hard to stay calm, because I knew that this story could have ended in disaster if Luis or anyone else had discovered the truth. But fortunately, that didn't happen. However, the worst part was that the other guys, Manuel, Rafael, and Alejandro, while saying goodbye to me, winked and said, "Wow, old man, you really went for it." This only made things more awkward because I wasn't sure what exactly they planned on telling Luis. They all knew what had happened, and I felt uncomfortable at the thought that one of them could ruin my life by telling the truth. Luis came from a wealthy family, his parents had influence in the city, and if anything had come to light, I could have had serious problems. I stood there, watching as they got into their cars and drove away, and with each second, my unease grew. I only wanted one thing: for them never to return to this hotel and for all of this to remain in the past. But you know, sometimes life gives you lessons you never forget. And that night was one of them. I still don't know if I did the right thing, but maybe it was my chance to feel like I was living life to the fullest, even if it was nothing like I had imagined. So here I am, sitting now, thinking about how all this even happened. Honestly, I don't know why I'm telling you all this. Maybe because I just needed to talk to someone. A story like this doesn't let you rest. It spins in your head, and no matter how much I try to forget it, I can't. I was used to a simple, routine life. Work, home, work, but after that night, it feels like everything's turned upside down. Luis, that guy who didn't even suspect that his beloved girlfriend was openly cheating on him, sincerely trusted me. He thanked me for the conversation, not knowing that I was a participant in something he was never supposed to know. And Carmen? She made me part of a game that I probably never even dreamed of. It was something surreal, like scenes from a movie. But you know, when you're at the center of events like this, you realize that it's not as fun as it might seem. On the one hand, I felt, how should I put it, young again, like I had found a second youth. But on the other hand, it was very awkward, especially when I was standing there saying goodbye to Luis and his group. They winked, smiled, threw me phrases like, "Wow, old man, you really went for it," and inside, I was only shaking at the thought that all of it might come to light. But you know, maybe it was just a momentary madness. Maybe I lost control over myself because of the alcohol, because of the whole atmosphere. But now that it's all over, I'm sitting here thinking, what would you have done in my place? If you found yourself in a situation where you were a witness to betrayal, a participant in a game that should never have happened. Would any of you have acted differently? I'd love to know your opinion. How would you have acted in such a situation? Did I do the right thing, or maybe I should have stopped right at the beginning, when I first saw Carmen and Manuel together? Or maybe all of this was just a test for me, one that, perhaps, I failed. I understand that everyone might have their own opinion, and maybe many of you will judge me for all this. But at that moment, I was someone else. I just felt that I was being drawn into a whirlwind of events bigger than myself. And now, as I tell this story, I feel a bit lighter. But before I finish, I'd like to apologize. You know, I'm not a native speaker, so there may be some mistakes in the text. I'm using artificial intelligence to express myself, and it helps me formulate my thoughts, but I'm still learning the language and trying to improve each time. I hope you understand, and I thank you for listening to the end. So, this is my story, and now it's yours. Think about it, and let me know what you think. Meanwhile, I'll keep trying to learn more and hopefully avoid getting involved in stories like this again. But who knows, life sometimes has surprises in store.